It already ended. Most people just have not realized it yet. And the silence is what gives it away more than anything else. The noise that used to fill the space is gone, replaced by something colder, something quieter, something that does not argue or protest or try to fix anything anymore. What is happening now is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is not even being announced, but it is final in a way that makes all the debates that came before it feel almost irrelevant. The shift is not coming, it has already happened, and the people who built their entire worldview on how things used to work are now standing in a reality that no longer responds to them. If you're enjoying these angry guy videos and you want to show some real support, you can buy me a Red Bull with a one-time gift or set up a monthly pledge. Using the link in the description of the video, it helps keep the straight talk coming without any filters. There was a time when the system ran on friction, when everything was negotiation, when people pushed against each other and called it progress, when tension was interpreted as a movement, and when every disagreement felt like it had a purpose. That time is over. And what replaced it is something that does not fight back in the way people expected because it simply opts out. That is the part that many still do not understand because they are waiting for resistance, for backlash, for confrontation, for something that looks like a battle. But what they are facing instead is absence. And absence is harder to deal with because there is nothing to argue against, nothing to persuade, nothing to pull back into the conversation once it has already walked away. You can see it in the small things first, in the everyday interactions that no longer happen, in the conversations that never start, in the messages that go unanswered, not out of hostility, but out of indifference. And that indifference is the real signal. It is not anger, it is not bitterness, it is not even resentment in the traditional sense. It is a kind of quiet recalibration where effort is no longer seen as worth the return, where participation is no longer seen as necessary, and where stepping back is not a protest, but a preference. People mistake this for temporary fatigue, but it is not fatigue, it is a shift in priorities that has already settled in. For years, the conversation was built on the idea that everything needed to be corrected, that everything needed to be rebalanced, that every perceived imbalance required intervention, and that intervention would lead to a better outcome. That belief drove policies, narratives, expectations, and behaviors. And it created a system where constant adjustment was the norm. But what happens when one side of that system decides that the adjustments no longer benefit them, that the cost of participation outweighs whatever reward is left, and that stepping away offers more peace than staying engaged ever did? That is where things are now, and it did not happen overnight. It was built slowly, layer by layer, decision by decision, until the tipping point was reached and the shift became irreversible. The idea that people would continue to play by the same rules indefinitely was always based on the assumption that the rules would continue to serve them. And once that assumption breaks, everything else follows. You start to see patterns that were ignored before. You start to recognize outcomes that repeat regardless of effort, and you begin to question whether the path you are on actually leads anywhere worth going. When enough people reach that conclusion at the same time, the system does not collapse in a dramatic explosion. It fades. It loses participation. It becomes something that exists but no longer functions the way it once did. There is a tendency to frame this as a conflict, as if it is one group pushing back against another, but that framing misses what is actually happening. This is not a fight, it is a withdrawal. It is not about proving a point, it is about no longer feeling the need to prove anything at all. That distinction matters because a fight invites resolution, it invites negotiation, it invites compromise, but a withdrawal closes the door on all of that. When someone decides they no longer want to be part of the exchange, there is no leverage left. There is no argument that brings them back. because they are no longer invested in the outcome. What makes this even more significant is that it is happening at the same time as broader economic and social pressures are increasing. The cost of living continues to rise, opportunities are shifting, stability feels less certain than it did before, and in that environment, people naturally begin to prioritize what gives them the most control over their own lives. For some, that means simplifying, reducing, cutting out anything that feels like an unnecessary drain on time, energy, or resources. The idea of building a life that is self contained, that does not rely on complex social dynamics or external validation, becomes more appealing when everything else feels unstable. And this is where you start to see the rise of minimalism, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a strategy, a way of reducing exposure to risk, a way of maintaining autonomy in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable. It is not about deprivation. It is about control, about knowing exactly what you need and making sure that you are not dependent on anything that can be taken away or disrupted. That mindset changes how people approach everything from work to relationships to long term planning. And once that shift happens, it is very difficult to reverse because it is rooted in a fundamental reassessment of what matters. At the same time, there are those who are still operating under the old assumptions, still expecting the same patterns to play out, still relying on the same dynamics that used to define interactions. When those expectations are not met, it creates confusion, frustration, and in some cases, panic, because the feedback loop they relied on is no longer there. They are asking questions that no longer have the same answers, and they are looking for responses from people who have already stopped engaging in that way. The disconnect grows wider, not because one side is refusing to listen, but because they are no longer in the same conversation at all. The concept of attention itself has changed, and with it, the entire structure of interaction. Attention used to be something that was given freely, something that was part of the social contract, something that could be expected as a baseline. Now it is treated as a resource, something that is allocated carefully, something that is not given unless it meets a specific threshold of value. That change alone alters everything because it means that the default is no longer engagement, it is neutrality. And from neutrality, it is a short step to disengagement. There is also a growing awareness of opportunity cost, the understanding that every hour spent on one thing is an hour not spent on something else. And when people start to evaluate their time through that lens, they become more selective about where they invest it. Conversations that once felt routine begin to feel unnecessary. Obligations that once felt automatic begin to feel optional. And the threshold for what is considered worth the effort rises. This is not about rejecting connection. It is about redefining what kind of connection is actually meaningful and sustainable. In parallel, the structure of work is changing in ways that reinforce this shift. Traditional paths that once provided stability are becoming less reliable, while alternative paths that offer flexibility and independence are becoming more accessible. The idea of building a life outside of the conventional framework is no longer as unrealistic as it once seemed. And for those who are willing to adapt, it offers a way to reduce reliance on systems that feel increasingly unstable. This is not a universal solution, but it is an option that more people are exploring. And as they do, it changes their perspective on everything else. When people find a way to sustain themselves without depending on the traditional structures, it gives them a level of freedom that changes their decision making process. They are less likely to tolerate situations that do not align with their priorities, less likely to compromise in ways that feel one sided, and more likely to walk away from anything that does not add value to their lives. That willingness to walk away is what defines the current moment because it shifts the balance of power in a way that is not immediately visible but becomes obvious over time. It is important to understand that this is not about hostility or opposition. It is about alignment. People are making choices based on what aligns with their goals, their values, and their sense of stability. And when something does not align, they are choosing not to engage with it. That is a fundamentally different approach from trying to fix or change something that does not work, because it removes the expectation that everything can or should be adjusted to fit. Instead, it accepts that some things are simply not compatible and moves on. This is where the idea of peace becomes central, not as an abstract concept, but as a practical goal. Peace is defined as the absence of unnecessary stress, the absence of constant negotiation, the absence of situations that require ongoing effort without clear benefit. When people experience that kind of peace, even briefly, it recalibrates their expectations and they begin to prioritize maintaining it. Anything that threatens that peace becomes something to avoid, not something to manage or endure. For those who are still expecting the old dynamics to return, this can be difficult to process because it feels like something has been taken away, like a system that once functioned has broken down. But from another perspective, it is not a breakdown, it is an evolution, a shift toward a different set of priorities that better reflect the current reality. The challenge is that not everyone is moving at the same pace, and that creates a period of mismatch where expectations and behaviors do not align. That mismatch is what creates the sense of instability, the feeling that something is off, that the usual patterns are not holding, that the responses you expect are not coming. It is not that people have become unpredictable, it is that they have changed the criteria they use to decide how to respond. Once you understand that, the pattern becomes clearer, and what looked like randomness starts to look like consistency within a new framework. There is a tendency to interpret this as a temporary phase, as something that will correct itself once conditions change. But that assumes that the underlying mindset will revert as well, and there is little evidence to support that. Once people have experienced a different way of living, a different way of allocating their time and energy, it becomes their new baseline, and they are unlikely to give that up unless there is a compelling reason to do so. Right now, for many, there is no such reason, and until that changes, the current trajectory is likely to continue. The real question is not whether this shift is happening, but what it means for the future, and that is where things become more complex. Systems that rely on participation need participants, and when participation declines, those systems have to adapt or they become less effective. That adaptation can take many forms, but it often lags behind the behavior it is trying to respond to, creating a period of adjustment where outcomes are uncertain. During that period, narratives will continue to evolve, explanations will be proposed, and attempts will be made to bring things back to what they were. But if the underlying conditions have changed, those attempts may not succeed. The more likely outcome is that new patterns will emerge, new expectations will form, and over time, what feels unfamiliar now will become the new normal. That process is already underway, and while it may not be evenly distributed or universally accepted, it is moving forward nonetheless. The key to understanding this moment is to recognize that it is not defined by what people are saying, but by what they are doing. And what they are doing is stepping back, simplifying, focusing inward, and prioritizing stability over complexity. That combination creates a kind of quiet resilience, a way of navigating uncertainty without relying on systems that no longer feel reliable. It is not flashy, it is not dramatic, but it is effective in a way that does not require validation from anyone else. And that is what makes it so difficult to counter, because it does not seek approval. It does not need agreement. It does not depend on external recognition. It simply exists as a set of choices that individuals are making based on their own assessment of reality. And as more people arrive at similar conclusions independently, the collective impact becomes significant even without coordination. What we are witnessing is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual realignment, a shift from one set of assumptions to another, from one way of organizing life to a different one that places a higher value on autonomy and a lower value on external expectations. It is not perfect, it is not without challenges, but it is coherent in a way that reflects the current environment more accurately than what came before. And once that kind of coherence takes hold, it tends to persist because it is reinforced by the outcomes it produces. People who adopt this approach find that it reduces friction, that it simplifies decision making, that it allows them to maintain a sense of control even in uncertain conditions. Those benefits are not easily dismissed, and they create a feedback loop that strengthens the behavior over time. So when you look around and notice the silence, the absence, the lack of engagement, where there used to be constant interaction, understand that it is not an accident, it is not a glitch, it is not something that will automatically correct itself. It is the result of a series of decisions that have accumulated to the point where they have changed the landscape, and that landscape is now defined by who chooses to participate and who chooses not to. And right now, more people than ever are choosing not to, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of a clear eyed assessment of what serves them and what does not. And once that clarity sets in, it becomes very difficult to convince them to go back to a system that they have already decided to leave behind. What makes this shift even more difficult for many to grasp is that it does not announce itself with a clear dividing line. There is no official moment where everything changes and everyone agrees that it has changed. Instead, it reveals itself in patterns that only become obvious after the fact, like noticing that a once busy street has gradually emptied out until one day you realize it is quiet at all hours. The transition is subtle enough that it can be ignored in the short term, but over time, the accumulation becomes undeniable. The behaviors that used to define interaction no longer carry the same weight, and the incentives that once motivated participation no longer produce the same response. There was an assumption for a long time that certain social dynamics were permanent, that they were built into the structure of society in a way that could not be altered without significant disruption. That assumption created a sense of security for some and a sense of obligation for others, and it shaped how people approached everything from relationships to career paths to long term planning. But permanence is often an illusion, especially when it depends on continued cooperation from individuals who are free to change their minds. Once enough people begin to reassess their role within that structure, the foundation starts to shift, not because it is being attacked, but because it is no longer being supported in the same way. One of the key drivers of this reassessment is the increasing awareness of trade offs that were previously ignored or downplayed. When people begin to evaluate not just what they gain from a situation, but what they lose in the process, it changes the calculation entirely. Time, energy, mental bandwidth, financial resources, and emotional investment all become part of the equation. And when the cost side of that equation starts to outweigh the benefit side, the rational response is to reduce exposure. This is not a dramatic act, it is a practical one, and it tends to spread as others observe the same imbalance and arrive at similar conclusions. At the same time, the information environment has changed in a way that accelerates this process. People are no longer limited to a narrow set of perspectives, and they are able to compare experiences, identify patterns, and draw conclusions at a scale that was not possible before. This does not mean that every conclusion is correct, but it does mean that individuals are less likely to accept a single narrative without question. When they see repeated examples of outcomes that do not align with what they were told to expect, it creates a gap between expectation and reality, and that gap becomes a catalyst for change. Another factor that cannot be ignored is the role of economic pressure in shaping behavior. When the cost of living rises and stability becomes harder to maintain, people naturally become more selective about where they invest their resources. Activities and commitments that once felt manageable begin to feel like liabilities. and the threshold for what is considered worthwhile increases. This does not necessarily lead to immediate withdrawal, but it creates a gradual shift in priorities that eventually leads to different choices. When those choices are made consistently over time, they reshape the landscape in a way that reflects the new reality rather than the old expectations. There is also a psychological component to this shift that is often overlooked. When individuals feel that their efforts are not producing meaningful results, it leads to a sense of diminishing returns, and that sense of diminishing returns discourages further investment. This is not about a lack of willingness to try, it is about the recognition that continued effort without proportional reward is not sustainable. Once that recognition takes hold, it changes the way people approach challenges, and it often leads them to redirect their focus toward areas where they feel a greater sense of control and a higher likelihood of positive outcomes. As this redirection occurs, it creates a feedback loop that reinforces the new behavior. People who step back from certain dynamics and find that their quality of life improves are unlikely to return to those dynamics without a compelling reason. The improvement does not have to be dramatic to be meaningful. It can be as simple as reduced stress, greater clarity, or a stronger sense of autonomy. Those incremental benefits add up over time, and they create a new baseline that becomes the standard against which other options are measured. For those who are still operating with, hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Within the old framework, this shift can feel like a loss of stability because the patterns they relied on are no longer producing the expected outcomes. They may interpret this as a temporary disruption, something that will correct itself once conditions normalize, but that assumption depends on the idea that the underlying behavior will revert as well. If the behavior does not revert, then normalization looks different, and the system that emerges may not resemble the one that came before. This is where the concept of adaptation becomes critical. Systems that fail to adapt to changes in behavior tend to become less effective over time, while those that adjust to new realities are more likely to remain functional. The challenge is that adaptation often requires acknowledging that the previous model is no longer sufficient, and that acknowledgement can be difficult, especially when it involves letting go of long held assumptions. However, without that acknowledgement, attempts to restore the previous state are likely to fall short because they are addressing symptoms rather than the underlying cause. It is also worth noting that this shift is not uniform across all groups or contexts. Different individuals and communities are responding in different ways based on their unique circumstances, and that creates a complex and sometimes contradictory picture. Some areas may still exhibit patterns that resemble the old dynamics, while others have moved further along the new trajectory. This uneven distribution can make it harder to see the overall trend, but it does not negate the fact that the trend exists. Over time, the areas that adapt more quickly may set the tone for broader changes, while those that resist may find themselves increasingly out of sync with the evolving landscape. In this environment, communication itself becomes more challenging because people are operating from different sets of assumptions and priorities. What one person sees as a reasonable expectation, another may see as unnecessary or even counterproductive. This divergence can lead to misunderstandings and frustration, especially when there is an expectation that everyone should be aligned. However, alignment is not guaranteed, and in a period of transition, it is more likely that multiple perspectives will coexist, sometimes uneasily, until a new equilibrium is reached. The idea of equilibrium is important because it suggests that the current state is not necessarily permanent, but it also does not imply a return to the previous state. Instead, it points toward a new configuration that reflects the accumulated changes in behavior, priorities, and constraints. That configuration may be more stable than the current transitional phase, but it will be built on different foundations and it will require different expectations. Understanding that distinction can help reduce the sense of disorientation that often accompanies periods of change. One of the more significant implications of the shift is the way it alters the concept of value. Value is no longer defined solely by external validation or traditional markers of success, but increasingly by internal criteria such as personal satisfaction, autonomy, and sustainability. This does not mean that external factors are irrelevant, but it does mean that they are no longer the primary drivers of decision making for many people. As a result, activities and relationships that do not align with these internal criteria are more likely to be deprioritized or abandoned altogether. This redefinition of value has a ripple effect across multiple areas of life. It influences how people approach work, leading some to seek alternatives to traditional employment structures that offer greater flexibility and control. It affects how they manage their finances, encouraging a focus on reducing unnecessary expenses and building resilience against uncertainty. It shapes how they engage with others, leading to more selective and intentional interactions rather than broad and indiscriminate participation. Each of these changes reinforces the others, creating a cohesive shift in behavior that is difficult to reverse once it has taken hold. Another aspect to consider is the role of expectations in shaping outcomes. When expectations are misaligned with reality, it creates tension, and that tension often leads to dissatisfaction. Adjusting expectations to better reflect current conditions can reduce that tension, but it also requires a willingness to let go of certain assumptions. This process can be uncomfortable because it involves confronting the possibility that previous beliefs were incomplete or outdated. However, without that adjustment, the gap between expectation and reality continues to widen, making it harder to navigate the changing environment effectively. As individuals adjust their expectations, they also adjust their strategies, and those strategies begin to diverge from what was once considered standard. Instead of following a prescribed path, they experiment with different approaches, looking for what works within their specific context. This experimentation can lead to a variety of outcomes, some successful, some less so, but it contributes to a broader pool of knowledge that others can draw from. Over time, certain patterns emerge as more effective, and those patterns begin to influence the collective behavior. This process is not without its challenges. There are risks involved in stepping away from established systems, and not everyone has the same capacity to absorb those risks. Factors such as financial stability, access to resources, and individual circumstances all play a role in determining how easily someone can adapt. This means that the shift may create new forms of inequality or exacerbate existing ones, even as it provides opportunities for some to improve their situation. Recognizing these nuances is important for understanding the full scope of what is happening. Despite these challenges, the overall direction remains consistent. People are moving toward greater self reliance, greater selectivity, and greater emphasis on what they can control. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it changes how uncertainty is managed. Instead of relying on external systems to provide stability, individuals are building their own frameworks that are more resilient to disruption. These frameworks may be simpler, more limited in scope, but they are also more adaptable, and that adaptability is increasingly valuable in a world where conditions can change rapidly. The long term implications of the shift are still unfolding, and it is difficult to predict exactly how it will evolve. However, certain trends are already becoming apparent. Participation in traditional structures is becoming more conditional, contingent on whether those structures continue to provide value. Alternative paths are gaining traction as viable options rather than fringe choices. The balance between individual autonomy and collective expectations is being renegotiated in real time, and that renegotiation is shaping the future in ways that are not yet fully understood. What is clear is that the current moment represents a departure from the assumptions that guided previous generations. The idea that certain roles, behaviors, and outcomes are fixed is being replaced by a more fluid understanding of what is possible. This creates both opportunities and uncertainties, and navigating that landscape requires a willingness to adapt, to reassess, and to make decisions based on current realities rather than outdated models. In the end, the most important factor is not whether the shift is positive or negative in absolute terms, but whether individuals are able to recognize it and respond in a way that aligns with their own goals and circumstances. Those who remain anchored to expectations that no longer match reality may find themselves increasingly frustrated, while those who adjust their approach may find new ways to achieve stability and satisfaction. The difference lies not in the external conditions alone, but in how those conditions are interpreted and acted upon. And that is where the real transformation takes place, not in the abstract discussion of trends and patterns, but in the individual decisions that collectively reshape the environment. Each choice to step back, to simplify, to prioritize differently contributes to the larger shift. And as those choices accumulate, they create a new baseline that becomes the reference point for what is considered normal. Once that baseline is established, the previous state becomes a point of comparison rather than a standard to return to. And the focus shifts toward navigating the new reality rather than trying to recreate the old one. There is another layer to this that sits beneath everything else, and it has less to do with visible behavior and more to do with internal calibration. People are not just changing what they do, they are changing how they interpret the world around them. The lens itself is being adjusted, and once that lens shifts, the same situation can produce a completely different response. What used to feel urgent now feels optional. What used to feel necessary now feels negotiable. And what used to feel rewarding now feels hollow if it does not meet a higher standard of meaning or return. This internal recalibration is subtle, but it is powerful because it changes the decision making process at its source rather than at its outcome. Part of this recalibration comes from exposure to repeated cycles that no longer produce satisfying results. When people go through the same pattern enough times and reach the same conclusion each time, it creates a kind of mental shortcut where they no longer need to test the pattern again to know how it will end. This is not cynicism in the traditional sense. It is pattern recognition applied over time. It reduces the willingness to re engage with situations that have already proven to be unproductive, and it shifts attention toward areas that offer a greater sense of progress or stability. Over time, this creates a narrowing of focus that prioritizes efficiency over exploration. Efficiency becomes a central theme in this environment, not just in terms of work or productivity, but in how people allocate every aspect of their lives. Emotional efficiency, social efficiency, financial efficiency, even cognitive efficiency all come into play. The goal is to minimize waste, to reduce friction, and to avoid unnecessary complexity. This does not mean eliminating all challenges, but it does mean choosing challenges that are worth the effort rather than those that feel imposed or arbitrary. The result is a more intentional approach to life that filters out anything that does not meet a certain threshold of value. This filtering process has a noticeable impact on social dynamics because it reduces the number of casual or default interactions that used to fill the space between more meaningful connections. When people become more selective, the overall volume of interaction decreases and what remains tends to be more deliberate. This can create the impression of isolation, but it is not necessarily driven by a lack of desire for connection. Instead, it is driven by a preference for quality over quantity, for interactions that feel aligned rather than obligatory. The challenge is that this preference requires a higher level of compatibility, which is not always easy to find. As a result, there is a growing divide between those who are willing to meet that higher threshold and those who are not. This divide is not always explicit, but it becomes apparent in the way people respond to opportunities for engagement. Some will step forward when they see value, while others will remain neutral or disengaged if the value is not immediately clear. This creates a kind of selective participation that can be difficult to predict because it depends on individual criteria that are not always visible to others. Another consequence of this shift is the reevaluation of risk. In the past, certain risks were considered acceptable because they were offset by expected rewards. Now, as those rewards become less certain or less appealing, the same risk may no longer be justified. This leads to a more cautious approach in some areas and a more experimental approach in others, depending on how the risk to reward ratio is perceived. People may avoid traditional paths that feel unstable while exploring alternative paths that offer greater control, even if those alternatives come with their own uncertainties. Control itself becomes a defining factor in decision making. The more control an individual feels they have over an outcome, the more likely they are to engage with it. Conversely, situations that feel unpredictable or dependent on external factors are more likely to be avoided. This preference for control does not eliminate uncertainty, but it changes how uncertainty is managed. Instead of accepting it as an inherent part of the process, people look for ways to reduce it, to limit exposure, and to maintain flexibility in case conditions change. Flexibility is another key element in this evolving landscape. The ability to adapt quickly to new information or changing circumstances becomes more valuable than rigid adherence to a fixed plan. This does not mean abandoning structure entirely, but it does mean designing structures that can be adjusted as needed. This approach allows individuals to navigate uncertainty without being locked into decisions that may no longer be optimal. It also reduces the cost of change, making it easier to pivot when necessary. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the limits of external validation. Metrics that once served as indicators of success are being questioned, especially when they do not align with personal satisfaction or long term stability. This leads to a shift away from seeking approval or recognition as primary goals and toward defining success on more individual terms. This shift can be empowering, but it also requires a greater level of self awareness because it places the responsibility for defining value on the individual rather than on external benchmarks. This increased responsibility can be both liberating and challenging. On one hand, it allows for greater autonomy and alignment with personal goals. On the other hand, it removes the safety net of predefined paths and expectations, requiring individuals to make more decisions without clear guidance. This can lead to a period of uncertainty as people experiment with different approaches and learn from the outcomes. Over time, however, it can also lead to a more refined understanding of what works and what does not, creating a more personalized framework for navigating life. Within this framework, resilience takes on a new meaning. It is not just about enduring difficulty, but about designing systems and habits that reduce the impact of difficulty in the first place. This proactive approach to resilience involves anticipating potential challenges and building buffers against them, whether through financial planning, skill development, or lifestyle choices. It is a form of preparation that emphasizes stability and adaptability rather than reaction and recovery. As more people adopt this approach, it begins to influence broader cultural norms. Behaviors that were once considered unconventional become more common, and what was once seen as an alternative path becomes a mainstream option. This gradual normalization of new behaviors can create a sense of momentum where the shift reinforces itself as more individuals see it reflected in others. At the same time, it can create tension with existing norms that have not yet adapted, leading to a period of coexistence between different models of behavior. This coexistence is not always smooth because it involves competing assumptions about what is reasonable, what is expected, and what is desirable. These differences can manifest in subtle ways, such as differing attitudes toward commitment, investment, and long term planning. They can also appear in more explicit disagreements about priorities and values. Navigating these differences requires a level of awareness and communication that is not always present, which can lead to misunderstandings or misinterpretations. However, over time, patterns tend to emerge that clarify these differences and make them easier to navigate. As people become more familiar with the new dynamics, they develop strategies for identifying alignment and avoiding misalignment. This can lead to more efficient interactions, even if the overall volume of interaction remains lower than before. The focus shifts from trying to engage broadly to engaging effectively, which can improve the quality of outcomes even as the quantity decreases. In this context, patience becomes an important trait because meaningful alignment often takes longer to establish than superficial interaction. Rushing the process can lead to mismatches, while taking the time to assess compatibility can increase the likelihood of a better outcome. This slower pace may feel unfamiliar in a culture that has emphasized speed and immediacy, but it aligns more closely with the goal of long term stability rather than short term gain. Another dimension to consider is the role of independence in shaping identity. As individuals become more self reliant, their sense of identity becomes less tied to external roles and more tied to their own capabilities and choices. This can lead to a stronger sense of self, but it can also create a disconnect from traditional markers of identity that were based on social or institutional affiliation. This shift can be disorienting for some, but it also opens up new possibilities for defining oneself outside of predefined categories. These possibilities are not without constraints, however, because they still operate within the broader context of economic and social realities. The ability to exercise independence is influenced by factors such as access to resources, education, and opportunity. This means that while the trend toward greater autonomy is widespread, its implementation varies depending on individual circumstances. Recognizing these differences is important for understanding why the shift may appear more pronounced in some contexts than in others. Even with these variations, the underlying direction remains consistent. People are moving toward models that emphasize control, efficiency, and alignment, and away from models that require sustained investment without clear or consistent returns. This movement is not driven by a single cause, but by a combination of factors that reinforce each other over time. As those factors continue to evolve, the shift is likely to deepen, further shaping the way individuals and systems interact. One of the more subtle but significant outcomes of this process is the reduction of noise in decision making. When people filter out unnecessary inputs and focus on what truly matters to them, it simplifies the decision process and reduces the likelihood of being influenced by irrelevant factors. This clarity can lead to more consistent and confident choices, even in the face of uncertainty. It also reduces the cognitive load associated with constantly evaluating competing options, allowing for a more streamlined approach to navigating complex environments. This streamlined approach does not eliminate complexity, but it changes how complexity is managed. Instead of trying to account for every possible variable, individuals focus on the variables that have the greatest impact on their outcomes. This prioritization allows them to allocate their attention more effectively and to avoid being overwhelmed by less significant factors. Over time, this can lead to a more stable and predictable decision making process, even in situations that are inherently uncertain. As this approach becomes more widespread, it has the potential to influence how systems are designed and how policies are implemented. Systems that align with these preferences for control, efficiency, and clarity are more likely to be adopted and supported, while those that do not may struggle to maintain participation. This creates an incentive for adaptation at a structural level as institutions respond to changing behavior in order to remain relevant and effective. However, adaptation at the structural level often lags behind individual behavior, creating a gap between what people want and what systems provide. Bridging this gap requires a willingness to rethink existing models and to experiment with new approaches that better align with current realities. This process can be slow and iterative, but it is a necessary part of adjusting to a changing environment. In the meantime, individuals continue to navigate the landscape using the tools and strategies available to them, refining their approach based on experience and observation. This ongoing process of adjustment and learning contributes to the overall evolution of behavior as successful strategies are adopted and less effective ones are discarded. Over time, this leads to a more refined set of practices that reflect the collective learning of those who have engaged with the shift. What emerges from this is not a single unified model, but a range of approaches that share common principles while allowing for individual variation. This diversity of approaches can be a strength as it provides multiple pathways for achieving stability and satisfaction. It also allows for greater resilience at a collective level, as different strategies can compensate for each other in the face of changing conditions. Ultimately, the significance of the shift lies in its cumulative effect. Each individual adjustment may seem small on its own, but together they create a substantial change in how people live, work, and interact. This change is not always visible in dramatic moments, but it is evident in the steady transformation of everyday behavior. It is reflected in the choices people make, the priorities they set, and the boundaries they establish. And as those choices continue to accumulate, they redefine what is considered normal, what is expected, and what is possible. The old patterns do not disappear entirely, but they lose their dominance, making space for new patterns that better align with the current environment. This ongoing process of redefinition is what shapes the future, not through sudden upheaval, but through the gradual and consistent application of new ways of thinking and acting. There is a quiet discipline forming underneath all of this that rarely gets talked about. And it has nothing to do with motivation in the traditional sense. It is not driven by hype or external pressure or even ambition, as it is usually defined. It is driven by a kind of internal order where people are becoming more deliberate about how they live, how they move, and how they respond to the world around them. This discipline does not need to be announced, and it does not seek recognition, but it shows up in consistency, in restraint, and in the ability to say no without hesitation when something does not align. That kind of discipline reshapes a person over time, and when enough people adopt it, it begins to reshape the environment as well. Restraint, in particular, has become one of the most powerful signals of this shift. In a culture that once rewarded constant engagement and visible effort, choosing not to engage becomes a statement in itself. It is not passive, it is intentional, and it reflects a deeper understanding of leverage. When someone no longer reacts to every stimulus, no longer feels compelled to respond to every expectation, and no longer participates in cycles that drain them, they reclaim a level of control that is difficult to disrupt. That control is not about dominating others, it is about governing oneself, and that distinction changes everything. This self governance leads to a reevaluation of impulses that were once taken for granted. Immediate reactions are replaced with measured responses, and in many cases, with no response at all. The space between stimulus and action becomes wider, allowing for more deliberate choices rather than automatic ones. Over time, this creates a sense of stability that is not dependent on external conditions. It allows individuals to operate from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. And that clarity reduces the likelihood of being pulled into situations that do not serve them. Clarity also sharpens perception, making it easier to identify patterns that were previously obscured by noise. When the constant flow of distractions is reduced, underlying dynamics become more visible, and that visibility leads to better decision making. People begin to notice not just what is happening, but how often it happens, under what conditions, and with what outcomes. This deeper level of observation informs their choices, reinforcing the tendency to avoid repeating unproductive patterns. At the same time, there is a growing emphasis on sustainability, not in an abstract sense, but in terms of daily living. The question becomes not whether something is possible, but whether it is sustainable over time without creating unnecessary strain. This applies to work, to relationships, to financial habits, and to lifestyle choices. Activities that require constant effort without offering stability are gradually phased out, while those that can be maintained with less friction are prioritized. This focus on sustainability leads to a more balanced approach that favors consistency over intensity. Consistency in this context is not about rigid routines, but about maintaining a steady trajectory. It is about making choices that can be repeated without diminishing returns, and about building systems that support those choices. This can include simple habits that reduce complexity, financial strategies that provide a buffer against uncertainty, and boundaries that protect time and energy. Each of these elements contributes to a larger framework that supports long term stability rather than short term gains. Within this framework, there is also a shift in how success is measured. Traditional markers such as status, visibility, and external validation are losing some of their influence, while metrics like freedom, control, and peace of mind are gaining importance. This does not mean that external achievements are irrelevant, but it does mean that they are no longer the sole indicators of progress. People are increasingly evaluating their lives based on how they feel on a daily basis, how much control they have over their time, and how resilient they are to external disruptions. This change in measurement alters the incentives that drive behavior. When the goal is no longer to maximize visibility or approval, but to maximize stability and autonomy, the strategies used to achieve that goal also change. Actions that once seemed necessary may no longer be prioritized, while actions that were previously overlooked may become central. This reordering of priorities can lead to a more streamlined and focused approach to life, where energy is directed toward what truly matters rather than what is expected. As these new priorities take hold, there is a noticeable reduction in tolerance for ambiguity in certain areas. People are less willing to engage in situations where expectations are unclear, where outcomes are unpredictable, or where the rules seem to shift without warning. This does not mean avoiding all uncertainty, but it does mean seeking clarity where possible and avoiding environments that thrive on confusion. Clear communication, defined boundaries, and predictable structures become more valuable because they reduce the cognitive load required to navigate interactions. At the same time, there is an increased tolerance for solitude, not as a fallback, but as a viable and even preferable state. Solitude provides a controlled environment where individuals can think, plan, and recharge without external interference. It allows for a level of focus that is difficult to achieve in more chaotic settings. and it supports the kind of introspection that leads to better decision making. As people become more comfortable with solitude, they become less dependent on constant interaction, which further reinforces their ability to choose when and how they engage with others. This comfort with solitude also reduces the pressure to conform to social expectations that do not align with personal goals. When someone is not reliant on external validation for their sense of worth, they are less likely to compromise their priorities in order to fit into a particular mold. This independence can be misinterpreted as detachment, but it is more accurately described as self alignment. It reflects a decision to prioritize internal consistency over external approval. And that decision has far reaching implications for how individuals navigate their environment. One of those implications is a shift in how commitments are approached. Commitments are no longer made lightly or based on external pressure, but are carefully considered based on their long term impact. This leads to fewer commitments overall, but those that are made tend to be more stable and more aligned with the individual's goals. It also reduces the likelihood of overextension, which can be a significant source of stress and instability. By limiting commitments to those that are truly worthwhile, individuals can maintain a higher level of performance and satisfaction. Another implication is a change in how setbacks are perceived. Instead of being viewed as failures, setbacks are increasingly seen as data points, as information that can be used to refine strategies and improve outcomes. This perspective reduces the emotional impact of setbacks and allows for a more analytical approach to problem solving. It also encourages a willingness to experiment because the cost of failure is reframed as part of the learning process rather than as a definitive outcome. This analytical approach extends to the evaluation of systems and structures as well. People are more likely to question whether a system is functioning as intended, whether it provides value, and whether it aligns with their needs. If the answer is no, they are more willing to disengage rather than attempting to force a fit. This willingness to disengage is a key factor in the broader shift because it reduces the ability of systems to rely on default participation. Systems must now demonstrate value in order to maintain engagement, and that changes the dynamic between individuals and institutions. As this dynamic evolves, there is a gradual redistribution of power, not in a dramatic sense, but in a more subtle and decentralized way. Power shifts toward those who are able to operate independently, who are not easily influenced by external pressures, and who can make decisions based on their own criteria. This does not eliminate the influence of larger systems, but it does create a more balanced relationship where individuals have greater agency. Agency in this context is not about absolute control, but about the ability to make meaningful choices within the constraints of reality. It is about having options, about being able to adjust course when necessary, and about not being locked into a single path. This flexibility allows individuals to respond to changes more effectively and to avoid being overly dependent on any one system or outcome. At the same time, there is a growing recognition that not all problems can be solved through external means. Some challenges require internal adjustments, whether in mindset, habits, or expectations. This recognition leads to a more holistic approach to problem solving that considers both external and internal factors. It also reinforces the importance of self awareness because understanding one's own tendencies and limitations is essential for making effective adjustments. Self awareness, combined with discipline and clarity, creates a foundation for navigating an environment that is constantly changing. It allows individuals to remain grounded even when external conditions are unstable, and it provides a framework for making decisions that are consistent with long term goals. This foundation is not built overnight, but it develops over time through consistent application and refinement. As more people build this foundation, it contributes to a broader cultural shift that values independence, intentionality, and sustainability. These values are reflected not just in individual behavior, but in the expectations that people bring to their interactions with others. There is less tolerance for unnecessary complexity, less patience for inefficiency, and greater emphasis on mutual alignment. This does not eliminate conflict or disagreement, but it changes the criteria by which those conflicts are evaluated. In many cases, conflicts are resolved not through negotiation, but through disengagement. When alignment is not possible, individuals are more likely to step away rather than attempt to force a resolution. This approach reduces prolonged conflict, but it also reduces opportunities for compromise. The result is a landscape where interactions are more binary, either aligned or not, either engaged or disengaged, with less emphasis on finding middle ground. This binary tendency can be both a strength and a limitation. It simplifies decision making and reduces ambiguity, but it can also lead to missed opportunities for collaboration where partial alignment might have been sufficient. Balancing this tendency requires a nuanced understanding of when to hold firm and when to remain flexible, and that balance is not always easy to achieve. Despite these complexities, the overall direction remains clear. People are moving toward a way of living that prioritizes control, clarity, and sustainability over participation for its own sake. They are redefining what it means to engage, what it means to succeed, and what it means to build a stable life in an environment that no longer guarantees stability through traditional means. This redefinition is ongoing, and it is shaped by the cumulative effect of individual choices. Each decision to simplify, to disengage, to focus inward, or to prioritize differently contributes to the broader pattern. Over time, these patterns become more visible and they begin to influence not just individual behavior, but the structure of the systems that surround them. What emerges from this process is not a return to a previous state, but the formation of a new equilibrium that reflects the current reality. This equilibrium may still be evolving, but its contours are becoming more defined, shaped by the principles of autonomy, efficiency, and alignment that have driven the shift from the beginning. And as this new equilibrium takes shape, it carries with it a different set of expectations, a different set of incentives, and a different understanding of what it means to participate in society. It is quieter, more deliberate, and less dependent on constant interaction, but it is also more resilient, more adaptable, and more closely aligned with the priorities of those who have chosen to step into it. There's a point where adaptation stops feeling like a reaction and starts becoming a philosophy. And that is where things begin to solidify. What was once a series of adjustments turns into a consistent way of operating, almost like a personal doctrine that guides decisions without needing constant reevaluation. At that stage, people are no longer experimenting in the same way. They are refining, sharpening, and reinforcing what they have already learned. The uncertainty that defined the earlier phase gives way to a kind of quiet confidence, not because everything is predictable, but because the individual has developed a system that can handle unpredictability without collapsing. This system is often built on a few core principles that remain stable even as external conditions change. One of those principles is self sufficiency, not in the absolute sense, but in the practical sense of minimizing reliance on factors that are outside of one's control. This might involve diversifying income sources, reducing fixed expenses, developing transferable skills, or simply maintaining a level of independence that allows for flexibility. The goal is not isolation, but resilience, the ability to absorb shocks without being forced into reactive decisions that compromise long term stability. Another principle that emerges is intentional limitation. This is the conscious decision to do less in order to achieve more meaningful results. It runs counter to the idea that more activity leads to more progress and instead emphasizes that focused effort in the right areas produces better outcomes than scattered effort across many areas. This limitation is not restrictive, it is strategic, and it allows for deeper engagement with what truly matters while avoiding the dilution of attention that comes from overcommitment. There is also a growing emphasis on predictability within personal systems, even as the external environment becomes less predictable. People are designing routines, habits, and structures that provide a sense of stability, regardless of what is happening outside. This does not mean rigid schedules, but it does mean creating anchors that keep them grounded. These anchors can be as simple as consistent daily practices or as complex as long term planning frameworks, but they all serve the same purpose: to reduce the impact of external volatility on internal stability. Within this context, decision fatigue becomes something to actively manage rather than passively endure. By simplifying choices and establishing clear criteria for decision making, individuals reduce the mental load associated with constant evaluation. This allows them to conserve cognitive resources for situations that truly require attention, rather than expending energy on minor or repetitive decisions. Over time, this leads to a more efficient use of mental bandwidth and a greater capacity for focus. Focus itself becomes a defining characteristic of this new approach. It is not just about concentration in the moment, but about sustained attention over longer periods of time. This kind of focus enables deeper work, more thorough analysis, and more consistent progress. It also creates a sense of momentum that reinforces the behavior as individuals see tangible results from their efforts. This stands in contrast to the fragmented attention that often accompanies high levels of external stimulation, where progress can feel scattered and inconsistent. As focus increases, so does the ability to filter information. Not all information is equally valuable, and learning to distinguish between signal and noise becomes an essential skill. This involves not only identifying what is relevant, but also deliberately ignoring what is not. The reduction of unnecessary input creates a clearer mental environment where important details are easier to recognize and act upon. This clarity supports better decision making and reduces the likelihood of being influenced by distractions or irrelevant factors. At the same time, there is a shift in how time is perceived and utilized. Instead of viewing time as something to be filled, it is treated as something to be protected. This leads to a more deliberate allocation of time toward activities that align with long term goals and away from those that do not. Idle time is not necessarily eliminated, but it is often used for reflection, planning, or recovery rather than passive consumption. This reallocation of time contributes to a more balanced and intentional lifestyle. Recovery, in particular, becomes a critical component of sustainability. Constant output without adequate recovery leads to diminishing returns. And recognizing this leads to a more cyclical approach to productivity. Periods of effort are balanced with periods of rest, allowing for sustained performance over time. This approach acknowledges the limits of human capacity and works within those limits rather than attempting to override them. In parallel, there is a growing awareness of the importance of environment in shaping behavior. The spaces people occupy, both physical and digital, have a significant impact on their ability to maintain focus, clarity, and stability. As a result, there is an effort to curate these environments in a way that supports desired outcomes. This might involve reducing clutter, limiting exposure to certain types of content, or creating dedicated spaces for specific activities. The goal is to align the environment with the individual's priorities rather than allowing it to dictate behavior. This alignment extends to social environments as well. People are becoming more selective about who they spend time with, prioritizing interactions that are constructive, supportive, or aligned with their goals. This does not mean eliminating all challenging interactions, but it does mean being more conscious of the overall impact of those interactions. Relationships that consistently create friction without offering value are less likely to be maintained, while those that contribute to growth or stability are more likely to be nurtured. As these changes take hold, there is a noticeable shift in how energy is managed. Energy is no longer treated as an unlimited resource, but as something that must be allocated carefully. This leads to a more strategic approach to engagement, where high energy activities are reserved for high value tasks and lower energy periods are used for maintenance or recovery. This optimization of energy use contributes to greater efficiency and reduces the likelihood of burnout. Burnout itself becomes something that is actively avoided rather than passively accepted. The recognition that burnout is not a badge of honor but a sign of imbalance leads to more proactive measures to maintain equilibrium. This includes setting boundaries, managing workload, and ensuring that there is sufficient time for rest and recovery. By addressing the factors that contribute to burnout before they escalate, individuals are able to maintain a more consistent level of performance over time. There is also a deeper understanding of the role of trade offs in every decision. Every choice involves giving up something in order to gain something else, and being aware of those trade offs allows for more informed decision making. Instead of focusing solely on the benefits of a choice, individuals consider the costs as well and weigh them against each other. This leads to decisions that are more aligned with long term goals, even if they involve short term sacrifices. As this awareness grows, there is less reliance on external guidance and more reliance on internal criteria. People develop their own frameworks for evaluating options based on their experiences, priorities, and understanding of the environment. This does not eliminate the value of external input, but it does reduce dependence on it. The result is a more self directed approach to decision making that is less influenced by trends or expectations. Within this self directed approach, there is a greater emphasis on accountability. When decisions are made based on personal criteria, the outcomes of those decisions are also owned more directly. This creates a feedback loop where successes and failures both contribute to learning and refinement. Over time, this leads to a more accurate understanding of what works and what does not, and a greater ability to adjust accordingly. Adjustment, in this context, is not reactive, but iterative. It involves making small, continuous changes rather than large, disruptive ones. This incremental approach allows for steady progress without the risk associated with sudden shifts. It also makes it easier to identify which changes are effective and which are not, because the variables are controlled and the impact is easier to measure. As these practices become more ingrained, they begin to influence not just individual outcomes, but the broader culture. Behaviors that were once considered unconventional become more accepted, and new norms begin to emerge. These norms are not imposed from the top down, but develop organically as more people adopt similar approaches. Over time, they shape expectations and influence how systems evolve in response. This evolution is not linear, and it is not without resistance. There are still elements of the old framework that persist, and there are still those who prefer or benefit from that framework. The interaction between these different models creates a dynamic environment where multiple approaches coexist. This coexistence can lead to friction, but it also provides a range of options that individuals can choose from based on their own preferences and circumstances. In navigating this environment, adaptability remains a key skill. The ability to adjust to changing conditions without losing sight of core principles allows individuals to maintain stability even as the landscape shifts. This balance between flexibility and consistency is what enables long term success in an uncertain environment. It allows for movement without losing direction and for change without losing identity. Identity itself becomes more fluid in this context, less tied to external roles and more tied to internal values and capabilities. This fluidity allows individuals to redefine themselves as needed, adapting to new opportunities or challenges without being constrained by previous definitions. It also reduces the pressure to conform to specific expectations, creating space for more authentic expression. As authenticity becomes more valued, there is less emphasis on maintaining appearances and more emphasis on aligning actions with values. This alignment creates a sense of coherence that is both internally satisfying and externally consistent. It reduces the cognitive dissonance that can arise from acting in ways that do not reflect one's beliefs, and it contributes to a more stable sense of self. This stability, in turn, supports better decision making, stronger boundaries, and more effective navigation of complex environments. It allows individuals to operate with a clear sense of purpose, even when external conditions are uncertain. It also reduces the likelihood of being swayed by temporary trends or pressures because decisions are grounded in a consistent framework. Ultimately, what is emerging is a more intentional way of living, one that prioritizes alignment, sustainability, and control over participation for its own sake. It is not defined by a single set of rules, but by a set of principles that can be applied in different ways depending on the individual. These principles provide a foundation for navigating a world that is constantly changing, and they offer a path toward stability that is not dependent on external systems remaining constant. And as more people adopt this approach, it continues to reshape the environment, creating new patterns, new expectations, and new possibilities. The shift is ongoing, but its direction is becoming clearer, driven by the accumulation of choices that prioritize clarity over confusion, stability over volatility, and intentional action over automatic response. There is a moment that comes after all of this, a point where the shift stops feeling like something external and starts feeling like the default state. At that stage, people are no longer comparing what is happening now to what used to be, because the comparison itself loses relevance. The old reference points fade, not because they are forgotten, but because they no longer serve a practical purpose in guiding decisions. What replaces them is a more grounded awareness of the present conditions and a willingness to operate within those conditions without expecting them to mirror the past. This transition into a new default creates a different kind of stability, one that is not based on predictability in the external environment, but on predictability in one's own behavior. When individuals know how they will respond to a range of situations, even if they cannot control the situations themselves, it creates a sense of internal order that reduces anxiety. This order is not rigid, but it is consistent enough to provide a foundation for decision making. It allows for a level of confidence that does not depend on external validation because it is rooted in self trust. Self trust becomes a cornerstone of this phase. It is built through repeated experience, through making decisions, observing the outcomes, and refining the approach over time. It is not about always being correct, but about being able to navigate uncertainty without losing direction. When self trust is established, it reduces the need for constant reassurance from others, and it allows individuals to move forward even when there is no clear consensus or guidance. With that self trust comes a different relationship with uncertainty. Instead of being something to avoid at all costs, uncertainty becomes something to manage, something that can be navigated with the right tools and mindset. This does not eliminate risk, but it changes how risk is perceived. It becomes less about fear of the unknown and more about assessing probabilities and preparing for different outcomes. This pragmatic approach allows for more calculated decisions, where risk is neither ignored nor exaggerated, but integrated into the overall strategy. As this mindset develops, there is also a shift in how progress is defined. Progress is no longer measured solely by external milestones, but by the degree of alignment between actions and goals. This creates a more nuanced understanding of advancement, where small, consistent steps are valued as much as larger achievements. It also reduces the pressure to achieve visible results in the short term, allowing for a more patient approach that prioritizes long term sustainability. Patience, in this context, is not passive waiting, but active persistence. It involves continuing to move forward even when immediate results are not apparent, trusting that the process will produce outcomes over time. This kind of patience requires discipline because it goes against the tendency to seek quick feedback or instant gratification. However, it also provides a more stable foundation for growth because it is less dependent on fluctuating external conditions. And in parallel, there is a growing emphasis on simplicity, not as a limitation, but as a form of optimization. By reducing unnecessary complexity, individuals are able to focus more effectively on what truly matters. This simplicity can manifest in various ways, from streamlined routines to minimalistic environments to clear and direct communication. Each of these elements contributes to a reduction in cognitive load, allowing for greater clarity and efficiency. Clarity, once established, has a compounding effect. It makes it easier to identify opportunities, to recognize potential pitfalls, and to make decisions with confidence. It also reduces the likelihood of being influenced by distractions or conflicting information because the criteria for evaluation are already defined. Over time, this clarity becomes a default state, shaping how individuals perceive and interact with the world around them. At the same time, there is a deeper appreciation for the role of boundaries in maintaining this clarity. Boundaries are not just about limiting external influences, but about preserving internal consistency. They define what is acceptable, what is not, and how much energy is allocated to different areas of life. Establishing and maintaining boundaries requires both awareness and discipline, but it is essential for preventing the erosion of the systems that have been built. These boundaries also create a framework for interaction, where engagement is based on mutual respect and alignment rather than obligation or expectation. This leads to more intentional relationships where both parties are clear about their roles and contributions. It reduces the likelihood of misunderstandings and conflicts because the parameters of interaction are more clearly defined. As relationships become more intentional, there is a shift in how trust is built and maintained. Trust is no longer assumed, but earned through consistent behavior over time. This creates a more stable foundation for interaction because it is based on observable patterns rather than assumptions. It also encourages accountability. As individuals recognize that their actions directly influence the level of trust they receive. In this environment, communication becomes more direct and purposeful. There is less tolerance for ambiguity or indirectness, and a greater emphasis on clarity and efficiency. This does not mean that communication becomes harsh or impersonal, but it does mean that it becomes more focused on conveying information accurately and effectively. This shift reduces the potential for misinterpretation and supports more productive interactions. At a broader level, these changes contribute to a redefinition of what it means to participate in society. Participation is no longer viewed as a default requirement, but as a choice that is made based on alignment with personal goals and values. This selective participation leads to a more diverse range of lifestyles and approaches as individuals choose paths that best suit their circumstances rather than adhering to a single standard. This diversity of approaches can create a more dynamic and adaptable environment, but it also requires a greater level of tolerance for different perspectives. As individuals pursue different paths, there is less uniformity in behavior and more variation in outcomes. This variation can be challenging to navigate, especially when there are conflicting expectations, but it also provides opportunities for learning and growth. Learning, in this context, becomes a continuous process rather than a defined phase. It is integrated into daily life as individuals gather information, test ideas, and refine their approach based on experience. This ongoing learning supports adaptability, allowing individuals to adjust to new conditions without losing momentum. It also fosters a sense of curiosity as people remain open to new possibilities and perspectives. Curiosity, when combined with discipline, creates a balanced approach to exploration. It encourages individuals to seek out new information and opportunities while also maintaining a focus on what is relevant and valuable. This balance prevents both stagnation and distraction, allowing for steady progress without unnecessary deviation. As this balance is maintained, there is a gradual accumulation of knowledge and experience that contributes to a deeper understanding of how to navigate the environment. This understanding is not static, but evolves over time as new information is integrated. It allows individuals to anticipate potential challenges, to recognize emerging patterns, and to respond effectively to changing conditions. This ability to anticipate and respond is what ultimately defines resilience in this context. It is not about resisting change, but about adapting to it in a way that maintains stability and alignment. It involves both preparation and flexibility, ensuring that individuals are not caught off guard while also remaining open to new possibilities. Preparation, in this sense, is not about predicting specific outcomes, but about creating conditions that allow for effective response regardless of the outcome. This might involve building financial reserves, developing versatile skills, or establishing networks that provide support when needed. Each of these elements contributes to a broader sense of security that is not tied to any single factor. As security becomes more internally generated rather than externally provided, there is a shift in how individuals relate to institutions and systems. Dependence decreases, and with it, the influence of those systems on individual behavior. This does not mean complete disengagement, but it does mean that engagement is more conditional and selective. Systems must demonstrate value and reliability in order to maintain participation, and this creates an incentive for them to adapt to changing expectations. Adaptation at the institutional level can take many forms, from policy changes to structural adjustments to shifts in communication. However, the effectiveness of these adaptations depends on how well they align with the evolving priorities of individuals. If there is a disconnect, participation is likely to remain limited, reinforcing the need for further adjustment. In the meantime, individuals continue to refine their own systems, creating a feedback loop where personal adaptation influences broader trends, and broader trends influence personal adaptation. This interplay shapes the trajectory of the shift as each layer of change interacts with the others. Over time, this process leads to the emergence of new norms, new expectations, and new ways of organizing life. These new structures may not resemble those that came before, but they are shaped by the same fundamental goal to create a stable and sustainable way of living in an environment that is inherently uncertain. And as these structures become more established, they provide a framework for others to build upon, creating a sense of continuity even as the underlying conditions continue to evolve. This continuity is not based on static rules, but on adaptable principles that can be applied in different contexts. In the end, what remains is not a fixed destination, but a dynamic equilibrium, a state where individuals and systems are continuously adjusting to each other in a way that maintains overall stability. It is not perfect and it is not without challenges, but it represents a shift toward a more intentional and resilient way of navigating the complexities of modern life. And once that equilibrium is reached, even temporarily, it becomes clear that the change was not just about what was lost or gained, but about how people chose to respond, how they redefined their priorities, and how they built a new framework that allowed them to move forward without relying on the assumptions of the past. There is a final stage in this progression that does not announce itself in any obvious way, yet it changes the tone of everything that follows. It is the point where the shift is no longer something that needs to be maintained with effort, but something that runs in the background like a steady current. At this stage, people are not thinking about the change as a change anymore. It has been absorbed into how they think, how they move, and how they respond without needing constant awareness. The friction that once came from adjusting to a new way of living begins to disappear, replaced by a kind of quiet efficiency that feels natural rather than forced. This natural efficiency shows itself in how decisions are made almost instantly without confusion or hesitation. The criteria have already been established through experience, so when a situation presents itself, it is evaluated quickly against those criteria and either accepted or rejected. There is no prolonged internal debate, no second guessing that drags on unnecessarily, and no need to seek outside confirmation for choices that fall within the established framework. This speed is not reckless, it is the result of clarity that has been built over time, and it allows individuals to move through situations with a sense of precision that was not possible before. Precision in this sense is not about perfection, but about alignment. It is about making choices that fit within a larger structure that has been deliberately constructed. When choices align with that structure, they reinforce it, making it stronger and more reliable. When they do not align, they are discarded quickly, not out of fear or avoidance, but out of recognition that they would introduce instability into a system that has been carefully balanced. This ability to maintain alignment without constant effort is one of the defining characteristics of this phase. At the same time, there is a noticeable reduction in emotional volatility when dealing with external events. Situations that would have previously triggered strong reactions are now processed with a level of detachment that allows for more rational responses. This detachment is not indifference, but control. It creates a buffer between stimulus and reaction, ensuring that responses are guided by intention rather than impulse. Over time, this leads to a more stable emotional state that is less influenced by fluctuations in the external environment. This stability extends to how individuals perceive challenges. Challenges are no longer seen as disruptions, but as part of the landscape that must be navigated. They are approached with a problem solving mindset rather than a reactive one, which reduces the stress associated with them. By reframing challenges in this way, individuals are able to maintain focus and continue moving forward without being derailed by temporary obstacles. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes how difficulty is experienced and managed. There is also a refinement in how effort is applied. Instead of spreading effort across multiple areas with varying degrees of effectiveness, it is concentrated on areas that have been identified as high impact. This targeted application of effort produces better results with less overall expenditure of energy, creating a more efficient system. It also reduces the likelihood of burnout because energy is not wasted on activities that do not contribute to meaningful progress. As this efficiency becomes more ingrained, there is a shift in how opportunities are evaluated. Not every opportunity is pursued, even if it appears beneficial on the surface. Each opportunity is assessed based on how well it integrates with existing priorities and whether it enhances or disrupts the current system. This selective approach ensures that growth does not come at the expense of stability and that new additions strengthen rather than weaken the overall structure. This selectivity can be misunderstood by those who operate under a different set of assumptions, particularly those who equate activity with progress. From the outside, it may appear as though less is being done, when in reality, what is being done is more focused and more effective. The visible output may be lower in quantity, but higher in quality, reflecting a deliberate shift toward meaningful results rather than superficial indicators of productivity. In this phase, there is also a deeper understanding of the limits of control. While individuals have increased control over their own behavior and systems, they recognize that external factors will always introduce a level of unpredictability. Instead of trying to eliminate this unpredictability, they design their systems to accommodate it. This might involve maintaining flexibility in plans, creating buffers to absorb unexpected changes, or simply accepting that not every variable can be managed. This acceptance reduces the frustration that comes from trying to control what cannot be controlled. With this acceptance comes a more balanced perspective on success and failure. Success is no longer viewed as a permanent state, and failure is no longer seen as a definitive outcome. Both are understood as temporary points within a larger process, and their significance is evaluated based on their long term impact rather than their immediate effect. This perspective allows individuals to remain steady regardless of short term fluctuations, maintaining focus on the broader trajectory rather than being distracted by momentary highs or lows. Another important aspect of the stage is the refinement of personal standards. Standards are no longer based on comparison with others, but on internal benchmarks that reflect individual goals and values. This removes the influence of external competition and allows for a more consistent and self directed approach to improvement. It also reduces the pressure to conform to external expectations, creating space for more authentic expression and decision making. Authenticity, in this context, is not about self expression for its own sake, but about alignment between actions and values. It is about operating in a way that is consistent with one's principles, regardless of external pressure or incentives. This consistency creates a sense of integrity that is both internally satisfying and externally recognizable. It also simplifies decision making because choices are guided by a clear set of principles rather than by fluctuating external factors. As individuals operate from this place of authenticity, their interactions with others also change. There is less need to manage perceptions or to adjust behavior to fit different contexts. Instead, interactions are based on a consistent presentation of self, which can lead to more straightforward and transparent communication. This transparency reduces the potential for misunderstandings and creates a more stable foundation for relationships. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all interactions will align with this approach, and that is accepted without resistance. When alignment is not present, individuals are more likely to disengage rather than attempt to force compatibility. This reduces unnecessary conflict and allows for a more efficient allocation of time and energy toward interactions that are mutually beneficial. This efficiency in interaction extends to how information is exchanged. There is a preference for clarity and brevity over complexity and excess detail. Information is conveyed in a way that is direct and purposeful, minimizing the potential for misinterpretation. This approach supports more effective communication and reduces the cognitive load associated with processing information. As these patterns become more consistent, they contribute to a broader sense of coherence in how individuals navigate their environment. There is less fragmentation in behavior, less contradiction between different areas of life, and a stronger sense of continuity. This coherence creates a stable foundation that supports long term growth and adaptation. Within this foundation, there is also a growing emphasis on maintaining optionality. Optionality refers to the ability to choose between different paths without being constrained by previous decisions. This is achieved by avoiding commitments that limit flexibility, by maintaining a range of skills and resources, and by staying open to new opportunities that align with existing priorities. Optionality provides a form of insurance against uncertainty, allowing individuals to adjust course when necessary without significant disruption. Maintaining optionality requires discipline because it involves resisting the temptation to overcommit or to lock into a single path prematurely. It also requires foresight, as individuals must anticipate how current decisions will impact future options. This forward thinking approach contributes to a more resilient system that can adapt to changing conditions over time. As this resilience is built, there is a noticeable shift in how individuals perceive the passage of time. Time is no longer seen as something that must be constantly filled or optimized for immediate output, but as a resource that can be allocated strategically across different phases of life. This leads to a more balanced approach where periods of intense activity are followed by periods of consolidation and reflection, creating a sustainable rhythm that supports long term progress. Reflection itself becomes an integral part of the process, providing an opportunity to assess what is working, what is not, and what adjustments may be needed. This reflective practice ensures that the system remains dynamic rather than static, allowing for continuous improvement without the need for disruptive changes. It also reinforces self awareness as individuals gain a deeper understanding of their own patterns and tendencies. As self awareness deepens, it enhances the ability to anticipate potential challenges and to prepare for them in advance. This proactive approach reduces the likelihood of being caught off guard and allows for more effective responses when challenges do arise. It also contributes to a sense of confidence as individuals know that they have considered various scenarios and have plans in place to address them. Confidence, in this context, is not about certainty, but about preparedness. It is the result of knowing that one has the tools, the strategies, and the mindset to navigate whatever comes next. This confidence supports a steady approach to decision making, reducing the influence of fear or doubt and allowing for more consistent progress. As this steady approach becomes the norm, it influences not only individual outcomes, but also the broader environment. The accumulation of disciplined, intentional behavior creates a pattern that others can observe and, in some cases, adopt. Over time, this contributes to a gradual shift in collective behavior as more individuals operate from a similar framework. This collective shift does not eliminate differences in approach, but it does create a set of shared principles that guide behavior across different contexts. These principles, centered around clarity, control, sustainability, and alignment, form the basis of a new way of navigating the complexities of modern life. They provide a reference point for decision making, even as specific strategies vary based on individual circumstances. In the end, what emerges is not a fixed system, but a flexible and adaptive framework that can evolve as conditions change. It is a framework that prioritizes stability without sacrificing flexibility, that values simplicity without ignoring complexity, and that supports individual autonomy while acknowledging the interconnected nature of the environment. And once this framework is fully integrated, it becomes less about reacting to the world and more about moving through it with intention, with clarity, and with a sense of control that is not dependent on external validation. It is not loud, it does not demand attention, but it is effective in a way that quietly reshapes both individual lives and the broader patterns that define how people live, work, and interact. There is a closing phase to all of this that feels less like an ending and more like a settling, a point where the noise has fully cleared. And what remains is a kind of quiet structure that no longer needs to be defended or explained. At this stage, the contrast between what once was and what now exists is no longer the focus because the comparison itself fades into irrelevance. What matters is not how things used to function, but how they function now. and more importantly, how individuals choose to operate within that reality without resistance, without confusion, and without the constant need to revisit old assumptions. This settling brings with it a different kind of awareness, one that is grounded rather than reactive. People are no longer scanning for validation or waiting for confirmation that their approach is correct. They have already tested it, refined it, and lived through enough variation to understand its strengths and limitations. This awareness allows them to move forward without hesitation, not because they expect perfect outcomes, but because they trust their ability to handle whatever outcomes arise. That trust becomes the anchor that keeps everything steady, even when conditions shift unexpectedly. What becomes clear in this phase is that stability is not something that is granted by the environment. It is something that is constructed internally and maintained through consistent behavior. This realization changes how individuals approach every aspect of life, from how they allocate resources to how they engage with others to how they plan for the future. It creates a framework where decisions are made based on long term coherence rather than short term reaction, and where the focus is on maintaining balance rather than chasing extremes. Balance itself takes on a more precise meaning. It is not about equal distribution of time or energy across all areas, but about aligning effort with priority in a way that produces sustainable outcomes. This means that some areas will receive more attention at certain times, while others are intentionally deprioritized. The key is that this distribution is deliberate rather than accidental, and that it can be adjusted as circumstances change without disrupting the overall structure. As this deliberate approach becomes ingrained, there is a noticeable reduction in wasted motion. Actions are more purposeful, conversations are more direct, and decisions are more efficient. There is less room for ambiguity, less tolerance for unnecessary complexity, and less inclination to engage in activities that do not contribute to meaningful progress. This does not create a rigid or restrictive lifestyle, but it does create a streamlined one where each component serves a clear function within the larger system. Within this streamlined system, there is also a refined understanding of value exchange. Interactions are evaluated not just in terms of what is gained, but in terms of how they fit within the broader context of one's goals and priorities. This leads to more equitable and intentional exchanges where both parties have a clear understanding of what is being offered and what is expected in return. It reduces the likelihood of imbalance and creates a more stable foundation for ongoing interaction. At the same time, there is an increased sensitivity to misalignment. When something does not fit within the established framework, it is recognized quickly and addressed without delay. This does not always mean immediate disengagement, but it does mean that the issue is not ignored or rationalized. It is evaluated honestly, and a decision is made based on whether it can be integrated without compromising the system. This decisiveness prevents small inconsistencies from growing into larger problems. As individuals operate with this level of clarity, there is a shift in how they experience pressure. External pressure loses much of its influence because decisions are no longer driven by external expectations. Instead, the primary source of pressure becomes internal standards, which are more stable and more aligned with personal goals. This shift reduces the stress associated with trying to meet conflicting external demands and allows for a more focused and consistent approach to progress. Consistency, in this context, becomes a form of quiet strength. It is not about maintaining the same pace or intensity at all times, but about maintaining direction. Even when circumstances change, the underlying trajectory remains intact, guided by principles that have been tested and proven over time. This consistency creates a sense of continuity that supports long term growth, even in the face of uncertainty. There is also a deeper appreciation for the role of time in shaping outcomes. Time is no longer seen as an adversary that must be managed aggressively, but as a factor that works in conjunction with effort to produce results. This perspective encourages patience and reduces the urgency to force immediate outcomes. It allows individuals to focus on building systems that will produce results over time, rather than chasing quick wins that may not be sustainable. As patience becomes more integrated into the process, it changes how progress is perceived. Progress is no longer measured by visible milestones alone, but by the stability and resilience of the systems that support those milestones. This creates a more holistic view of success, where the journey itself is as important as the destination because it determines the sustainability of the outcome. Sustainability ultimately becomes the defining metric. It is not enough for something to work in the short term. It must be able to function over an extended period without creating imbalance or strain. This focus on sustainability influences every decision, from how resources are allocated to how commitments are made to how risks are managed. It ensures that growth is not achieved at the expense of stability and that progress can be maintained over time. As this mindset solidifies, there is a noticeable reduction in reliance on external narratives. Individuals are less influenced by trends, opinions, or expectations that do not align with their own framework. This independence allows for a more authentic and consistent approach to life, where decisions are guided by internal criteria rather than external pressure. It also reduces the noise that can interfere with clear thinking, creating a more focused and deliberate approach to navigating the environment. This deliberate approach extends to how individuals engage with uncertainty. Instead of attempting to eliminate it, they incorporate it into their planning, creating systems that are flexible enough to adapt without losing stability. This might involve maintaining multiple options, building buffers against potential disruptions, or simply remaining open to adjusting course as new information becomes available. This flexibility allows for continued progress even when conditions change unexpectedly. As flexibility and stability are balanced, there is a growing sense of control that is not dependent on external conditions. This control is not absolute, but it is sufficient to provide confidence in one's ability to navigate challenges and capitalize on opportunities. It creates a foundation for decision making that is both grounded and adaptable, allowing individuals to move forward with clarity even in uncertain environments. At the same time, there is a recognition that not everything needs to be optimized. There are areas where simplicity and sufficiency are more valuable than efficiency or growth. This recognition prevents overcomplication and ensures that the system remains manageable. It also allows for a more balanced lifestyle, where not every aspect of life is treated as a problem to be solved or a process to be improved. This balance between optimization and sufficiency creates space for reflection and recalibration. Individuals are able to step back, assess their progress, and make adjustments without feeling pressured to constantly push forward. This periodic recalibration ensures that the system remains aligned with evolving goals and conditions, and that it does not drift into inefficiency or imbalance over time. As this process continues, there is a gradual convergence between intention and action. What individuals aim to do becomes more closely aligned with what they actually do, reducing the gap between planning and execution. This alignment increases effectiveness and reinforces confidence as individuals see their intentions translated into tangible outcomes more consistently. With this convergence comes a sense of completion, not in the sense of reaching a final destination, but in the sense of achieving coherence between different aspects of life. Work, relationships, finances, and personal development all begin to operate within a unified framework, reducing conflict and creating a more harmonious overall structure. This coherence supports long-term stability and provides a foundation for continued growth. As this foundation is maintained, it becomes less about reacting to the world and more about shaping one's own path within it. Individuals are no longer defined by external conditions, but by how they choose to engage with those conditions. This shift in perspective creates a sense of agency that is both empowering and stabilizing, allowing for a more intentional and controlled approach to life. And when viewed from this perspective, it becomes clear that the shift was never about collapse or crisis in the way it was often described. It was about recalibration, about stepping back from systems and patterns that no longer served a purpose, and about building something more aligned with current realities. It was about recognizing that participation is a choice, not an obligation, and that stepping away can be just as powerful as stepping in. So, to those who made it this far, the ones who stayed through the entire conversation and followed the thread all the way to its conclusion, this is where it lands. Shout out to the 2 hour gang for staying locked in until the end, because most people never get this far. Most people drop off long before the picture becomes clear. If you are enjoying these angry guy videos and you want to support what is being built here, you can show that support by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It keeps everything moving and allows this kind of content to keep coming. I want to know what you think about everything that was laid out here, whether you agree, whether you see it differently, or whether you're already living in this shift without even realizing it. So leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.